It's funny how quick we are to hide the parts of ourselves that feel messy or difficult. The famous analytical psychologist Carl Jung once said, "How can I be substantial without casting a shadow? I must have a dark side, too, if I am to be whole. And by becoming conscious of my shadow, I remember once more that I am a human being, like any other." It's a really profound thought, isn't it? Before we even begin to touch on clinical definitions or textbooks today, we have to acknowledge a fundamental truth. Experiencing sorrow, unrest, and tension, well, that's just part of the human package. We all cast a shadow.
So, welcome to this explainer on the concepts of abnormality and psychological disorders. Today, we're taking a fascinating look into a word that gets thrown around all the time, abnormal. We're going to break down what it actually means when a behavior crosses the line from a typical struggle into a psychological disorder. Let's get started. Just think about your own life recently. You've likely felt some everyday stressors, right? Getting nervous before a big exam, feeling tense about your career path, or experiencing deep anxiety when someone close to you is unwell. These are completely universal experiences. We all face major problems and failures at some point. The key difference in abnormal psychology is that sometimes a person has a truly extreme reaction to these everyday stressors. Their ability to adapt and modify their behavior in response to changing needs just sort of breaks down.
Let's look at the word itself. Abnormal literally translates to away from the normal. It implies that you're deviating from some clearly defined standard. But here's the catch, and this really highlights the challenge of psychology. We absolutely do not have a universal, ideal model for human behavior. There's no perfect, standard human being out there in a museum to use as a baseline for comparison. So how exactly do professionals figure it out? To solve this, clinicians often lean on a framework known as the 4Ds. It's a fantastic, catchy little mnemonic to help us understand the clinical threshold where everyday struggles become recognized disorders. The 4Ds are deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. We're going to look at each of these closely because together they form a highly useful starting point for exploring psychological abnormality.
First up, we have deviance. This refers to behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that are markedly different from what is expected. We're talking about reactions that are extreme, highly unusual, or sometimes even bizarre. But remember, because we don't have that perfect ideal human model, deviance is highly contextual. It's all about how far behavior strays from the anticipated reaction in a specific given situation. Moving on to the second D, distress. This is a big one. Abnormal behavior isn't just about acting weird. It usually carries a really heavy emotional toll. It involves feelings that are deeply unpleasant and upsetting. And what's crucial here is that this distress isn't just felt by the individual experiencing the disorder. It can also be profoundly upsetting to the people around them. It's like this radiating discomfort that signals something isn't quite right internally.
Then we hit the third D, which is dysfunction. This is where behavior starts actively putting up roadblocks in your daily life. A psychological disorder typically interferes with a person's ability to carry out normal, constructive activities. If your thoughts or emotions are literally preventing you from going to work, maintaining relationships, or just taking care of your basic personal needs, that behavior has firmly crossed into the territory of dysfunction. And finally, danger. Now, this isn't present in every single psychological disorder, but it is a critical component in the overarching definition of abnormality. It simply means the behavior is posing a possible physical threat or severe risk to the person themselves or to others around them. When you put these 4Ds together, deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger, you start to get a much clearer picture of what clinicians are looking for. Now, even with those 4Ds in our back pocket, distinguishing between normal and abnormal is still heavily debated. Psychologists generally fall into two basic and sometimes conflicting camps. It's essentially a clash between the deviation from social norms approach and the maladaptive behavior approach. Think of it as the tension between how well we fit into a group versus what is actually healthy for us as individuals. Let's unpack the first one. So, approach one is all about social norms and conformity. Under this lens, abnormal is essentially just a label for breaking society's unstated rules for proper conduct. But the massive problem with social norms is how deeply subjective they are. Norms grow entirely out of a particular culture, its history, values, institutions, and habits. Did you know that just a few decades ago, being left-handed was widely considered an abnormal trait that needed to be corrected? It totally was. That shows how arbitrary these rules can be. For instance, a culture that highly values competition might readily accept aggressive behavior as totally normal, but contrast that with a society that emphasizes cooperation and family values, like in India. In that context, the exact same aggressive behavior might be considered completely unacceptable or even abnormal. So that actually brings up a massive flaw with this whole approach. Is normality literally nothing more than just conforming to social norms? Serious questions have been raised about this. Society's values change drastically over time. What was considered psychologically abnormal 50 years ago might be perfectly acceptable today, and vice versa. Assuming that socially accepted behavior is automatically healthy is a pretty dangerous game to play. Which brings us to approach 2, maladaptive behavior. This approach shifts the focus away from rigid conformity and moves it toward actual human flourishing. Notice how we define well-being here. We aren't just talking about mere survival or maintaining a pulse. Drawing on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, true well-being includes growth, fulfillment, and the actualization of your potential. If a behavior helps you grow and reach that potential, it's adaptive and normal. If it hinders that growth, it's maladaptive. Here is the wild part about this second approach. Perfectly conforming behavior can actually be highly maladaptive. Think about a student who sits perfectly still and remains absolutely silent in class, even when they are completely lost and have a ton of questions. Society might praise them as a good, quiet, conforming student, but that behavior is maladaptive. It interferes with their optimal functioning and learning. It actually suggests an inability to cope or a vulnerability rather than true health. So take a second and just think about your own community. If you talk to the people around you, you'll likely find they have very vague, sometimes frankly frightened ideas about psychological disorders. Why are we so afraid of this label? Why does the word abnormal make us so uncomfortable, pushing people right back into the shadows Carl Jung talked about? Honestly, that fear mostly stems from superstition, ignorance, and just a profound amount of stigma attached to mental illness. Historically, and unfortunately even now, people hold on to these beliefs that mental unrest is something to be deeply ashamed of. And this stigma is incredibly dangerous. Why? Because it means people who are suffering are hesitant to consult a doctor or a psychologist. They feel ashamed of their problems, so they just suffer in total silence. But if we strip away all that superstition and just look at the science, what we learn from this explainer is actually incredibly simple and deeply human. Psychological disorders at their very core just indicate a failure in adaptation to life challenges. They happen when a person's ability to modify their behavior in response to changing environmental needs simply becomes overwhelmed. It's a maladaptive response to stress, nothing more, nothing less. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If a psychological disorder is fundamentally just a failure to adapt to life's complex challenges, if it's essentially a breakdown in our emotional immune system under extreme stress, shouldn't we view it exactly like we view any other physical illness? A broken leg or a lingering cold carries zero moral failing or shame. As we wrap up this explainer, I challenge you to carry that perspective forward. Let's step out of the shadow of stigma and into a much clearer, far more compassionate understanding of the human mind.